The ditch had been there long before the houses were built. A narrow strip of earth cutting through the back of the properties, quietly guiding rainwater away every time storms rolled through the valley. But one morning, Daniel Carter looked out his window and realized something was terribly wrong. The ditch was gone, and what replaced it would soon create a disaster no one in the neighborhood expected. Daniel had lived in Pinewood Creek for 8 years. It was a quiet neighborhood where neighbors waved politely and lawns stayed trimmed like clockwork. The drainage ditch behind the properties had always been part of the landscape, barely noticeable unless heavy rain arrived. When storms came, water flowed through it like a small river, then disappeared beyond the tree line. It kept everyone safe, at least, it used to. That morning Daniel walked into his backyard and froze halfway across the grass. The ditch behind the fence had been completely filled with fresh dirt and gravel. Heavy construction equipment tracks cut across the soil, and sitting directly on top of the filled ditch was a brand new guest house. It belonged to his neighbor, Margaret Doyle. She had recently built the small structure behind her main house for visiting family. The building looked neat and expensive, with fresh paint and large windows facing the yard, but Daniel felt a quiet unease settle in his chest. Because the drainage ditch wasn't decorative, it was essential. Without it, stormwater had nowhere to go. Daniel knocked on Margaret's door that afternoon to ask about the construction. Her answer was casual and confident. She said the ditch looked ugly and unnecessary, so she had simply filled it. The builders told her it wouldn't matter. Daniel stared at the new guest house behind her property line and suddenly realized something that made his stomach sink. The next heavy rain would test that decision, and when it did, the entire neighborhood would witness the consequences. For the next 2 weeks, the weather stayed clear, sunshine covered Pinewood Creek, and the neighborhood looked peaceful as ever. Children rode bicycles down the sidewalks while sprinklers watered carefully trimmed lawns, but Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the missing drainage ditch. Every time he looked out his kitchen window, the guest house stood where the waterway once ran. The fresh dirt around it still looked loose, like the ground hadn't fully settled, and that worried him, because weather forecasts were beginning to change. One afternoon the news predicted a strong storm system moving toward the region. Heavy rainfall was expected overnight. Daniel stood outside that evening studying the slope of the land behind the houses. The terrain gently curved downhill toward the old ditch location. For decades, stormwater had flowed through that path naturally, but now the path was blocked. The water would have to find somewhere else to go. Later that night, dark clouds rolled across the sky. Rain began falling slowly at first, tapping against rooftops and tree leaves. Then the storm intensified. Within an hour, water started gathering across the grass behind the properties. Daniel watched from his back porch as the rain continued pouring down. The ground near Margaret's new guest house quickly turned muddy. Without the ditch, the water began spreading outward instead of flowing away. At first it formed shallow puddles. Then those puddles began merging into something larger. By midnight, the backyard looked completely different. Water stretched across the entire low section of land like a growing lake, and Margaret's brand new guest house stood directly in the middle of it. Daniel stared through the rain, realizing something he had hoped wouldn't happen. The ground beneath that building had once carried thousands of gallons of stormwater every year, and now it had nowhere left to go. Morning arrived with gray skies and heavy silence across Pinewood Creek. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind soaked lawns and puddles across the neighborhood. Daniel stepped outside carefully, walking toward the back fence to see the damage. What he saw made him stop. The filled ditch had turned into a wide pool of standing water. The rain had nowhere to drain, so it simply collected in the lowest part of the land, exactly where the ditch used to run. Margaret's guest house stood surrounded by muddy water. The structure itself looked intact, but the ground around it had softened dramatically. Sections of the soil had already begun sinking slightly beneath the weight of the building. Neighbors slowly gathered outside their homes, staring toward the flooded area. Some whispered quietly about what had happened, others shook their heads. Daniel wasn't angry, he just felt uneasy, because the storm they had experienced was not even the strongest one of the season. Later that afternoon, Margaret stepped into her backyard for the first time since the rain stopped. Her confident expression disappeared the moment she saw the water. The grass around her guest house had turned into a soggy swamp. Even worse, one corner of the small building leaned slightly lower than the others. Daniel walked over and calmly explained what the drainage ditch used to do. For years, it carried stormwater safely away from the neighborhood, but Margaret looked frustrated rather than concerned. She insisted the builders had assured her everything was safe. Daniel nodded politely, but deep down he knew something she hadn't realized yet. The soil beneath that guest house had once been part of a natural water channel, and nature had a way of reminding people when they blocked its path. Over the next several days, the water slowly disappeared, sunlight dried the soaked grass, and the backyard looked almost normal again. Margaret seemed relieved, convinced the problem had solved itself, but Daniel knew better. Storm season had only just begun. A week later, weather reports warned of another incoming storm system much stronger than the first. Dark clouds returned to Pinewood Creek late that evening, stretching across the sky like a heavy blanket. By midnight, rain was falling harder than before. Daniel watched from his window as water quickly spread across the same low section of land behind the houses. This time it happened faster, without the drainage ditch. The stormwater built up rapidly. The ground around Margaret's guest house became saturated within minutes. Soon the muddy water reached the base of the building again. But something new began happening. The small structure started shifting slightly, not collapsing, just moving. The saturated soil beneath the foundation had weakened. The water pressure slowly lifted sections of the ground, and because the guest house was relatively light, it began rising unevenly above the flooded soil. From Daniel's porch, it almost looked like the building was floating. The sight drew neighbors outside despite the rain. Flashlights pointed toward the backyard as people watched the strange scene unfold. Margaret stood on her patio, staring in disbelief. Her new guest house, the one she proudly built just weeks earlier, now leaned awkwardly above the muddy water. Daniel didn't say anything, he simply watched quietly, because this moment revealed the truth more clearly than any argument ever could. When the storm finally passed the next morning, Pinewood Creek looked completely different. Mud covered the grass, and shallow pools of water stretched across the yards behind several homes. But everyone's attention focused on one thing: Margaret's guest house. The building hadn't collapsed, but it definitely wasn't sitting where it had been before. The foundation had shifted several inches, tilting the structure slightly to one side. The soft ground beneath it had been slowly pushed upward by the trapped stormwater. It looked almost as if the building had tried to float. Neighbors gathered quietly near the fences, discussing what they were seeing. Margaret stood beside the structure with a worried expression that hadn't been there before. For the first time, she seemed to understand what the old ditch had done for decades. Later that afternoon, a city inspector arrived after several neighbors reported the flooding issue. He walked along the backyard studying the terrain carefully. When he reached the guest house, he paused and examined the filled drainage ditch beneath the structure. His conclusion was simple. The ditch had been part of the neighborhood's original stormwater system, filling it without proper drainage. Replacement had redirected water into the surrounding land, which explained the flooding and the shifting foundation. Margaret listened quietly as the inspector explained the solution. The drainage channel would have to be restored. Otherwise, the flooding would continue every time heavy rain arrived. Daniel stood nearby, saying nothing, because sometimes the clearest lessons came from nature itself. Within a few days, construction crews returned to Margaret's backyard. Large equipment carefully removed sections of the soil beneath the guest house, exposing the original drainage channel that had been buried weeks earlier. The ditch slowly reappeared as workers restored the path stormwater had followed for decades. It was messy work, but necessary. Engineers explained that water always searched for the lowest path through land. Blocking that path didn't stop the water, it only forced it to gather somewhere else. And in this case, that somewhere else had been directly beneath Margaret's guest house. As the channel reopened, the surrounding ground began drying naturally again. The next small rainstorm arrived only a few days later. This time, everyone watched closely. Instead of spreading across the yards, the stormwater flowed smoothly through the restored ditch and disappeared beyond the tree line, just like it had for years. Margaret stood quietly beside the construction site, realizing how easily the problem could have been avoided. Daniel approached and gave a small reassuring smile. He wasn't there to say "I told you so." He simply hoped the neighborhood would learn something from the experience, because sometimes nature had its own quiet way of explaining how things worked. By the end of the month, Pinewood Creek had returned to its usual calm routine. The restored drainage ditch once again guided rainwater safely through the back of the properties, disappearing into the wooded creek beyond the neighborhood. Grass grew back across the muddy areas, and the yards slowly regained their familiar green color. Margaret's guest house was repaired and carefully reinforced on stable ground beside the ditch rather than directly on top of it. The structure no longer leaned awkwardly after storms. Most importantly, the flooding problem had finally disappeared. Neighbors often walked past the restored channel without giving it much thought, but Daniel noticed something different. People respected it now. They understood why the narrow strip of earth existed in the first place, because sometimes small details in a neighborhood carry responsibilities people don't immediately see. Margaret eventually thanked Daniel for explaining the drainage system early on. She admitted she had underestimated how important it was. Daniel simply nodded. After all, he never wanted conflict. He only wanted the neighborhood to remain safe and peaceful for everyone living there, and in the end, the lesson became clear to the entire community. Nature always remembers its path, and when people block it, the water simply waits for the moment it can return. And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.